Hi, my name's Nick Herriman, and in this lecture I want to explain to you Clifford Geertz's idea of symbols as models. Clifford Geertz belongs to an approach in anthropology we call symbolic anthropology, and this approach predominated in the 1960s and the 1970s. Within symbolic anthropology, there were two ways of studying symbols. One was the structural approach. Structural anthropology analyze symbols in terms of basic underlying units of meaning. What this means is that we studied, if you like, the DNA of meaning. So Needham, for example, in his primary factors, talked about basic ideas like up, down, black, white, night, day, backwards, forwards. And from these very basic dichotomies or binaries, as they're sometimes called, as they're sometimes called, you could develop things like images like a witch, which would be black, not white, backward, not forward, up, not down, night, not day, moon, not sun, that kind of thing. Levi-Strauss was a bit more complicated. He would get narratives and find them to have similar underlying structures. So you have something, for example, Cinderella and Ash Boy. Cinderella, it's a story about a girl, whereas Ash Boy, it's a boy. Yet there's a similar structure as much as the girl is poor and the boy is poor. The girl is named after the remnants of fire, Cinder, as in Cinderella. The boy is named after the remnants of fire, Ash is in Ash Boy, and so on. So you sort of develop a parallel structure in two ostensibly different stories. And what structuralist anthropologists showed was underlying meanings which otherwise we would be unaware of. However, what we're going to look at today is not structural anthropology, but interpretative anthropology. And this kind of anthropology focuses on getting a deep or thick understanding of what symbols mean to people. So interpretive anthropology is a way of doing anthropology like evolutionary anthropology or functionalism. Now, it treats cultures as things to be interpreted, and it focuses on meaningful actions and symbols. And because the focus is on interpretation, hence we get the name Interpretative Anthropology, and this should help you remember the name. Within Interpretative Anthropology, there are several famous figures. Victor Turner, his work on Forest of Symbols, you might have heard of the idea of the liminal stage and rites of passage. Victor Turner wrote about that. Mary Douglas, Purity and Danger, you might have heard of the ideas of how filth is culturally constructed. Sherry Ortner's Key Symbols, Eric Wolf's version of Guadalupe, and probably most famous of all is Clifford Geertz's book, The Interpretation of Cultures, in particular, two chapters in there, Religion as a Cultural System, which we'll talk about today, and Deep Play, Notes on a Balinese Cockfight. So as I suggested, for Geertz, culture is a text. Quotes, culture of a people is an ensemble of texts which the anthropologist strains to read over the shoulders of those to whom they properly belong. So what Geertz was encouraging us to do was to think about anthropology as less as a science which tests hypotheses and more as a discipline associated with interpretation. So anthropology is not an experimental science in search of a law, but an interpretative one in search of meaning. I'll give you an example. A functional anthropologist looks at the way we worship. I come from a town called Fremantle in Western Australia, and every year the fishermen there do a ritual where they bring out a statue of the Virgin, and it's called the Blessing of the Fleet. It blesses the fleet of fishing vessels. Now, it's designed to, if you ask the fishermen, well, at least in the 1950s, the fishermen who were Italians who had come from Sicily in the south, why they did that, they would say, oh, it's to ensure good luck on the fishing, to make sure the Virgin Mary protects us. A functionalist anthropologist say, no, really what you're getting at here it's an excuse to provide social cohesion. It brings the group together. It also provides you fishermen with a sense of confidence, and that confidence will make you more successful in your fishing and expose you, make you able to deal with the dangers you're exposed better than if you were nervous. So that's the function of this ritual. That's what a functional anthropologist would say. And indeed, the functional anthropologist is not too concerned with what the fisherman has to say. The interpretative anthropologist takes a different approach. He's asking different kinds of questions altogether. He's thinking, okay, what does the virgin really mean to you? And he'll say, okay, well, she's a kind of, so the fisherman might say, well, she's like my mum. And so the anthropologist will look at the idea of mother, of virginity, and try and get at a deeper understanding. I'll give you an example, and that comes from Woolf's version of Guadalupe, which I referred to in the previous slide. And in that piece, Woolf talks about how the Virgin of Guadalupe, which is an apparition of the Virgin in Mexico in the late 1500s, and that apparition means different things to different people. For sort of Spanish-style Mexicans with very authoritative fathers, the death of Christ represents the death of the father, and for them that's kind of expresses an Oedipal desire, if you like. For the indigenous, the Native American, Aztec and whatever cultures, the Virgin of Guadalupe represented a continuity with the past, and the Earth Mother Goddess, I think her name was Tepeyac, I can't remember. So interpretive anthropology looks for deeper meanings and significance, where a functionalist anthropologist is really not too concerned with those, but just how the ritual or the symbol works to help the individual or the group to survive. Okay, let's look at Geertz in a bit more detail now. Geertz sees humans as animals suspended in webs of significance they themselves have spun. What he means by this is, think about a spider. If a spider attaches to this wall back here, there are different ways a spider can attach. You can be in this kind of a web of concentric circles. It could be big drooping kind of webs. It could be funnel webs, different kinds of webs. And if you think about the wall, think of that like reality. So there are different ways to attach to the wall, different way a spider attaches to the wall. In the same way, there are different ways we can attach ourselves to reality. You see, as I did when I was doing fieldwork, 2 planes crashing into 2 towers in New York. For some people, it's part of a large Zionist plot. For other people, it's an expression of revenge for the crimes perpetrated by the US on Muslims. Maybe for people within the US, it takes on different meaning, like an unprecedented attack on persecution of innocent victims and so on. So there are different ways, if you like, to attach yourself to reality. So the way a New York firefighter attaches himself to that reality is different to the way, I don't know, one of the Al-Qaeda people, if you believe they're involved, attaches themselves to that reality. So our job is to work out, as anthropologists, what different meanings people attach to that. So an anthropologist looks at the way an Al-Qaeda supporter might look at that reality, as opposed to the way an American firefighter or an Australian or whatever would associate themselves to that, and tries to get into a very thick description. A thick description is just like this. You can see my eye, what my eye is doing right now. You can say, oh, that's just a eyelids contracting, 2 eyelids muscles contracting, and the 2 eyelids meet. That would be a thin description. A bit thicker, you'd say, oh, well, what Nick is doing here is closing his eyes to demonstrate what a wink looks like. Go a bit deeper, you'd say, well, in Australian and other Western cultures, there's a thing called a wink, which indicates the winker and the winky, the person who's being winked to, sharing a joke or sharing something that other people aren't privy to. Then a deeper A deeper explanation still says, well, Nick is providing a lecture online and he's providing a demonstration, which indicates a wink, and keeps on going and going. The deeper you go, the thicker the description, if you like, and the better it is from an anthropological perspective. So culture is a set of these kinds of meanings, which are set in symbols. So the meaning of symbols, which we're talking about here, is publicly available symbols, the symbols that everybody shares. Okay, so Geertz's focus is mainly in this text is on sacred symbols, and what he talks about is a synthesis of your worldview, what you think the world is, how you think the world is, and your ethos, the way you think you should act. And the way sacred symbols make the world, the way you look at the world, seem emotionally convincing, and the way you act seem rational. Now, there's a kind of clear link here. The way you act will be related to how you see the world. If you believe that there's a God who determines everything in the world, it makes sense to pray to him. If you don't believe that there's a God, it doesn't make sense to pray to him. So the way you look at the world, your worldview, and ethos, the way you act, are naturally
The next thing, models of and models for. Turns out I needed another screen that was bigger. So I've got some little things to show you what a model for is. A model for is basically instructions for how to live or how to do things. So an example of a model for, I just got this, is Indonesian instant noodles. And on the back of that, it gives you directions for how to, instructions or directions for how to cook these noodles. And this is what we would call a model for. Another example I just found in the bedroom is how to install the television stand. So these are directions or models for how to install it. One, the parts, then how to install it, and then warnings, etc. So those things are models for. They tell you how to behave or how to act. Another example of a model for comes from the Bible. This is an Indonesian Bible, Indonesian English Bible. A model for how to behave comes from the Ten Commandments. This is a famous part of the Jewish Tanakh, as it's called in the Christian Bible. It's a point where Moses receives from God 10 commandments, 10 instructions for how to live. Do not commit murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not lie. And can you remember the other ones? I wonder if you can. So there are 10 of those. They're models for how to behave. Now, as for models of, what I could find in my bedroom is this is a model of Strasbourg. It's an image of Strasbourg. That is a model of the world. It's not a model for how to behave. It's a model of how things look in the world. Here's another one in Azay-le-Rivière, obviously in France, a place of France. Here's a model of a place in France. Now, for another model of, we go back to the Bible, and well, the Torah, as the Jewish people call it. We go back to the Bible, or the Alkitab in Indonesian, and we go back to the very start of Genesis, or Bereshit, as the Jewish people call it, and we have, in the beginning there was darkness, and God said, called the light day and called the darkness light, and there was light, and etc., etc. God said that there'd be space between the waters, and that was the land, and so on day 2, day 3. That's a model of how the world was created. So you have models for how to behave and models of how the world is. Models for tell you how to behave, they instruct you, they're directions. Models of is like the worldview, what the world looks like, how it is created, how it was created.
And humans as an animal is quite unique. and this relates to instincts for survival. Compare a spider, a whale, and a human. Which of these animals or insects has the least natural abilities to survive, the least instincts to survive? The answer is humans. A spider comes born with a kind of imprint. It knows exactly everything it needs to know is already with it. It doesn't learn much. It just goes out and does what's hardwired, if you like. A whale comes with less knowledge and needs more help from its mother in particular to be reared. But the one with the least, born with the least knowledge of all, is humans. We're born with almost no instincts for survival. We don't know how to make tacos. We don't know how to hunt. We don't know how to gather. We don't know how to make a living. We don't know how to pay a bill, for example. All these things we have to learn, and all of that stuff basically is culture. And that, if you're watching this, you and I share some cultures with other people, and our job is to get that stuff that we share, whether we communicate through words and symbols, to the kids, the babies who are just being born. That's one of our big jobs in life, is to transmit that, and then their job is to transmit it on. Because without that, we are literally nothing. We die. This is not the case with a beaver. A beaver, for example, knows what it needs to do right from the beginning. It knows how to make a dam. If I want to make a dam, I need to get a blueprint. I need a guide for how to make a dam. So these are models for how to behave. A model of is a picture of the world. Now here is a model of I guess it's a fire on an ocean. It's a very artistic model of a fire on an ocean. Maybe it's a sunset, I'm not sure. Apologies for my ignorance of art. This was just popping up my computer. Le Corbusier, no, that's not it. Where is it? Sorry, I can't tell you what that was. I'm sure you art people would know. All right. So that presents it's a way of representing the world. Now humans are unique. We're from our first etchings on caves up until I suppose this is 19th century art like this, and into the 21st century, we are unique in that we are the only species that likes to go about making models of the world. Now, I'll give you an example. If a model for how to behave was the Ten Commandments, a model of the world would be like Adam and Eve, and God created the world in 7 days, created Adam, gave him a wife, etc. That's a model of the world, how it all happens, how it all fits together. Okay, so models for, models of. A model for is an ethos. A model of is a world view. So religion has these models of and models for, but they're not just simply models of or models for. The Bible by itself, according to this Geertzian approach, would not be such an effective way to make people become Christians or Jews. What you actually need is to establish long-lasting and powerful and pervasive moods and motivations in people. And so when we're talking about moods and motivations, these tie into the ethos, which is like the style of life or what to do. Think about moods. You know, Christmas is a certain mood. People run around, and there's a certain feeling you should have at Christmas of I don't know. The ideal is to be at peace with everybody, etc., etc. The reality, of course, can be different, but it's often this gap between the reality of Christmas of being closely tied and at peace with the world, and that's the symbolic image and the reality that makes Christmas so difficult for some people. So there's a Christmas mood, there's a New Year's mood, which is one of revelry and excitement. There's an Easter mood, if you're a Christian, of solemnity and reflection. There are moods, but there are also motivations. Christmas makes people go out in the West and cook a turkey. New Year's makes them go out and pop some champagne and kiss somebody. Easter makes them share eggs and chocolate. And that, of course, brings people closer and together. And these are tied into your worldview, your conception of everything. So the reason why we celebrate Easter is that, if you're a Christian, is that Christ was crucified on the cross. The reason why you celebrate Christmas is because Christ was born. I'll leave that there. So what these, you've got your models of, you've got your models for, you've got your moods, you've got your motivations, and all this addresses things like problems of meaning. Problems of meaning are questions, if you like, existential questions of why is there suffering in the world? Why haven't I got what I deserved? Why do I have to work for a living? Now, in a classic Christian perspective, the reason why I have to work for a living, apologies for using Christianity, I'll just use that today though, just for one example. The reason why I have to work for a living is because Adam sinned in the Garden of Eden. God was angry and said, because you have not followed my command and you've eaten from the tree of knowledge, you and your kind will have to work forever and you will live in sin. And Jesus, of course, will redeem me from that sin. This is the explanation of why there is suffering, why I have to work, why there is sin in the world, because I can go back now to God, the way God created the world. Okay, and that explains problems of meaning. Why is there suffering? Why did this plane fall out of the sky, killing 176? That's because it's God's will. That's how I look at it as a Christian. If I look at it as an atheist, I say, oh, it's complete coincidence. Again, from an anthropological perspective, this belief in coincidence is a form of religious perspective. If I am a Zandi person, I might think of the reason why the plane fell out of the sky was because of witchcraft. A witch affected the pilot. If I was a certain kind of Confucian Chinese person, I might say it's because the ancestors were angry. I get different ways of answering problems of meaning, such as why did a plane fall out of the sky? Now, again, it's not enough just to have these beliefs. They need to appear real. And the beliefs that we're talking about belong to number 2, the religious perspective. But before we get there, we should contrast that with the common sense perspective. Common sense perspective is pretty simple. It's what we need to survive and get around in the day. I want to staple the paper together, get a stapler, and ching, it's stapled. I know I use a stapler to do that. A religious perspective goes beyond the simple appearances of daily life and ask what lies behind them. So if, for example, the plane falls out of the sky, there is an inquest, and we discover that the pilot, that the engine had a problem with it that was completely uncontrollable, if you like. It just like a bushel was made with the wrong kind of rubber and burnt, and that set the plane on fire, so it crashed out of the sky. Now, most people would say, yes, but why did that happen to that plane and not the other plane that was flying at the same time, or not the other 300 planes of the same model and make that were flying at the same time? Now, to answer this, we need to go beyond the common sense perspective of the world and move to a religious perspective. It could be quite simple to say it's a coincidence. It can become more complicated. It's God, it's the ancestors, it's witchcraft, it's spirits or whatever. Now, so what this is talking about is what is really real, what lies behind the appearance of things in this world. Every day it appears, every day we see the sun come up and go down, apparently come up and go down. What lies behind that? What keeps it all going? Well, a religious person might say God, or whatever it is they believe in, a tortoise, or whatever it is. So if you're looking at this red ball that's coming, this red circle, or red circle that's coming up in the morning, common sense says the sun is rising. The religious perspective sees that there's God behind it. The scientific perspective says, well, actually the sun isn't rising. The earth is revolving, giving the appearance of sunrise. I guess it's a scientific kind of perspective. Scientific perspective says, okay, well, it looks to you like a solid material hand is holding up a solid material stapler, but in fact what looks like a stapler is just a bunch of neutrons and electrons, which are in fact, it's mostly space, it's mostly gaps, and your hand is mostly gaps. So it appears like a solid thing, but it's not really. And although it appears as matter, since Einstein, we've decided, well, actually, this matter can also be, it's also a form of energy, and energy is a form of matter, and so on. So what the appearance of the world is also questioned, but in a different kind of way. The aesthetic approach to reality is different again. Fill up my encyclopedia of art, and we see here's an aesthetic way of looking at reality. Two people from an artist or an artistic or aesthetic perspective appear like this. Okay, so there are different ways to represent from an aesthetic perspective. So that's a woman from one aesthetic perspective, this is from another aesthetic perspective. Within the scientific, there's different scientific perspectives like pre-Newtonian, post-Newtonian perspectives. Within the religious perspectives, it's different again. There's God, there's spirits, and common sense perspectives also vary between cultures. But what we're really concerned with here is the religious perspective. What we need is for culture to work, we need these perspectives, particularly religious perspective, to appear to be fact, to make models of the world convincing, so that the world as lived is the world as imagined. It brings together ethos and worldview, so they reinforce each other. And you can transit from the common sense thing like, okay, my brother died, and move that to a religious perspective because it was God's will, or because of witchcraft or whatever. So you go from what is real, my brother died, to what is really real, what lies behind the appearances of that death, God's will, witchcraft, whatever it might be. And it makes moods and motivations of life seem uniquely realistic. So Christmas, if you're into Christmas, it appears you feel really unique and really, if it's working for you, happy. Same with a wedding. A wedding's great because you get models of and models for, and they come together. For example, on top of the wedding cake, you have a bride and a groom. These are, if you like, a model of the ideal bride and groom. But when you see the bride and groom standing up together on the altar, next to the altar, I've just been to a wedding recently, and I noticed a lot of people were crying and had tears coming down their eyes because they're really emotionally invested and they're seeing a reality that kind of connects this ideal image of bride and groom with the reality of bride and groom that you see in front of you. Okay, it appears uniquely real, and you feel it. You feel a reality of, you know, the joining together of man and woman, as it was in this case. Okay, so models of and models for come together particularly in rituals. I've talked about Christmas, and I've just talked about a wedding. These are rituals. Rituals are basically symbols in action. So let's have a look at this terrible illustration. So we're talking about religion. It's a set of symbols. It's a cultural pattern. You have models for how to behave, an ethos like the Ten Commandments. You have models of a worldview, which is, for example, the Garden of Eden and God commanding that Adam lives on the earth and has to work. And just to make it clear again, a model for includes something like how to make a taco. A model of includes something like a representation of a fire or a sunset or whatever it is. Now these come together in rituals. And in rituals, there's a sense of commitment. We have to engage and believe, and then we will see. It's not like people, for example, often say, oh, you know, I believe in God when I see it. But that's just taking a common sense perspective towards religion. Most religious people don't take that perspective. They have another perspective, which is, if I believe first, then what can I see? So if you invest yourself in Christmas, or if you invest yourself in the rituals of the church or the synagogue or the mosque or whatever, then you will see, then you will understand. And then the models for and models of will come together. And they'll provide for you moods like one of peace, of resignation, like during a funeral, peace and resignation, hopefully, during our wedding, of happiness and joy, during Christmas, of peace and goodwill, during New Year's, of revelry and excitement, during Easter, of reflection and a sense of indebtedness to Christ, for example. They don't really go anywhere, though, so Geertz is more interested in motivation, what it makes you do, makes you get married, makes you give the bride and groom presents and this kind of stuff. So that's his vision of religion, but it's very important because it gives us a vision of the importance of symbols. So in conclusion, symbols are vehicles which provide models of the world and models for how to behave within the religious perspective. And I hope that explains to you Geertz's idea of symbols.